Hi, my name is Julia, and I'm going to be presenting a cross-cultural article entitled Guilt, Shame, and Embarrassment, Similar or Different Emotions, a Comparison Between Italians and Americans by Giorgetta and colleagues. The literature shows that there are distinctions between these three self-conscious emotions. Guilt is a negative moral self-evaluation. It comes about when a person believes they violated their own moral standard. So it's a moral and pro-social emotion where people experience a sense of responsibility for a mistake and they often feel the desire to apologize for it. In contrast, shame is a non-moral negative self-evaluation. So it doesn't focus on accountability or moral failure, but rather on personal inadequacy or incompetence. And shame arises when there's a gap between the actual self and the ideal self. So when a person feels like they've fallen short of who they want to be. So it's more socially orientated than guilt. Embarrassment is the mildest of the three, and it's less about moral wrongdoing and more about social awkwardness or self-presentation. So it's what we feel when we violate social conventions, like saying something awkward or tripping in public. These emotions are often difficult to differentiate because they all involve negative self-evaluation. So Castelfranchi and colleagues from 1998 all the way till 2018, they contributed to the literature for guilt, shame, and embarrassment, but they also expanded on it by proposing 3 criteria domains that define the structure of these emotions. First is a type of self-evaluation, so whether the person judges themselves based on inadequacy, like I'm not good enough, or harmfulness, like I've caused harm to this person. Then second is whether the attention is directed towards the discrepancy between the actual and the ideal self or towards the perceived responsibility for someone else's harm. And third, the domain of self-esteem involved. So which aspect of the self is currently being threatened? Is it moral, social, or competence? Analyzing scenarios through these 3 domains provides a cognitive framework for distinguishing how different patterns of self-evaluation will give rise to distinct self-conscious emotions of either guilt, shame, or embarrassment. So other literature is showing that shame is actually a very hard word to translate cross-culturally. Vergüenza, the Spanish translation of shame, was found to be blended with features of shame but also embarrassment, while in English it only overlapped with guilt. So in Spanish, shame holds a social and relational importance rather than a more self-evaluation like it does in Americans. Many authors argued that because of this, vergüenza should not be considered equivalent to shame in English. But what about looking at shame in Italy, another Latin language? So what don't we know? First and foremost, the main distinctions between these emotions that Castelfranchi and his colleagues have claimed have not yet been empirically tested. So the researchers in this paper wanted to know about how these emotions diverge and how they're related to each other, as well as their cross-cultural differences in Italians and Americans. And an important gap in the literature is also that there was less attention that was being paid to embarrassment. So only very few articles were focusing on the differences between shame, guilt, and embarrassment. The research question in this paper is whether scenarios built based on Castelfranchi's framework would effectively elicit the target emotions, and then to compare the emotion ratings in Italians versus Americans. The terms were translated from English to Italian, with guilt being colpa, shame vergogna, and embarrassment imbarazzo. The researchers hypothesized that the major difference between the 2 cultures would be related to shame and vergogna. This hypothesis is rooted in the research where vergüenza was shown to be more social and interpersonal in Spain. For this study, participants were recruited online from Italy and the United States. Italian group was 180 adults, American group had 80. Both were well educated, roughly the same age range, between 20 to 50 years old. The researchers used a scenario-based approach built around Castelfranchi's distinctive theoretical framework, and each short written scenario was built to trigger primarily one of the 3 emotions, guilt, shame, or embarrassment, and this method allowed the authors to objectively test whether those theoretical elements actually did elicit the expected emotion in real people, and then to compare the patterns across 2 cultures. So this table is from Giorgetta's article. It demonstrates the elements that were used to create the different scenarios. So the scenarios were constructed using Castelfranchi and colleagues' 3 criteria domains to distinguish and elicit each emotion. So for guilt, it was focused on moral wrongdoing and responsibility for harm. For shame, it was about failing to live up to one's ideal self or self-image. And for embarrassment, it centered on violating social conventions or feeling exposed in public. So in the online survey, participants read a total of 16 short scenarios presented in a random order. 4 were designed to elicit guilt, 4 for shame, and 8 for embarrassment, half involving familiar people and half involving strangers. And after each scenario, the participants were asked to imagine themselves as the main character and rate how strongly they would feel 6 emotions: guilt, shame, embarrassment, anger, fear, and regret, using a 10-point scale. So 1 being not at all and 10 being extremely. Those extra 3 are the control emotions. And this design allowed the researchers to measure emotions experimentally using Castelfranchi's framework. They found that the scenarios did actually successfully elicit all 3 targeted emotions in both cultures, with guilt and embarrassment being similarly understood across Italians and Americans. So both cultures even understood embarrassment as a clearly distinct emotion, which further supports the literature. But they did find cultural differences in shame and vergogna, as the authors had suspected. Americans viewed shame as a more moral emotion overlapping with guilt, whereas the Italians viewed vergogna as both moral but also social, frequently overlapping with embarrassment. So the authors inferred from this that shame seems to cover only part of the meaning that vergogna carries in Italian. So this supports the findings with vergüenza in Spain holding a social connotation over Americans. And lastly, Italians reported stronger reactions to all the scenarios compared to Americans. The results support the structural distinctions that Castelfranchi proposed, so using their 3 criteria domains to distinguish guilt, shame, and embarrassment worked in both cultures. Although, with cultural differences being observed in the overlap between emotions, this demonstrates that culture and language can influence how individuals experience or understand emotions despite direct translation. This shows that self-conscious emotions can be distinguished, yes, but they are not universal categories because their meanings can shift across languages and cultures. Giorgetta even provides an expansion to the framework, showing 2 cultures can have the same emotion, but significant differences in their intensity. So what have we learned thus far? For Italians, shame carried a more social exposure meaning, whereas for Americans, it retained a stronger moral connotation, more tied to guilt. So to help explain this, we can look at findings by Frederici and her colleagues, who compared 2 Western groups, Italian and US Americans' context sensitivity and fears of isolation. They found that Italians tend to process information more holistically than Americans, interpreting events more socially and in relation to others rather than from an individual outlook. So this can help explain why vergogna can be seen as a social emotion for Italians considering their holistic approach. And they found that Italians resemble Eastern populations more than they do Western groups, which can further help explain why Italians may experience some emotions differently from their Western counterparts. This can be expanded by Burton and colleagues' study, which looked at individualism, collectivism, and personality in Italians versus Americans. They found that Italians tend to be more collectivistic than Americans, which supports Hofstede's data. And they also found that Italians with higher vertical collectivism were more extroverted, agreeable, and conscientious. So those are 3 personality variables that are involved for the well-functioning in a group, which is consistent with a collectivistic orientation of seeing oneself as part of a community. So this can help us understand maybe why 2 Western populations could differ in their interpretation of shame. A very recent paper unleashed a new potential argument to maybe help explain this finding, where Western individualistic cultures favor direct emotional articulation and collectivistic cultures depend more on social cues in their emotional expression. So this can help explain why Americans express shame as morally internal, consistent with direct articulation, and why Italians might express vergogna more intensely and socially, consistent with indirect relational emotional processing. Let's move on to a study by Imordino Yang and colleagues, which showed that more emotionally expressive cultures tend to have more activation in their DAI, meaning that emotions are experienced more intensely and felt more viscerally. The dorsal anterior insula is the region that links the body sensations to emotional experience, gathering emotion-related bodily responses. This offers a potential neurobiological explanation for Giorgetta's findings that Italians report stronger emotional reactions than Americans. So maybe this is not just because of their social norms, but because their brains encode and integrate emotion states more tightly. Now let's discuss the weaknesses of this study. Despite having a section on psychometrics, which I recognize and encourage, there were no effect sizes reported, which limits the reader's ability to quantify the magnitude of the measurement differences and actually interpret the real practical findings of the research. Next, this study used a scenario-based approach with a Likert scale. It may not be an issue per se, but implementing multiple methods would help with external validity. For example, conducting a qualitative interview with the participants' post-survey responses would help explore why they respond the way they do cross-culturally. So this could help with separating true score differences from response bias. And third is what I consider to be the biggest issue: the translation method was unidentified. So there was no mention of how the survey was translated for Italians. So was it direct translation? Was there translation and adaptation? Are the researchers bilingual? Was there an expert committee? Was there back translation? They did not mention this. Now for the strengths. By presenting standardized vignettes designed to elicit specific emotions, they created a controlled and replicable method. So this helps with internal validity of this approach for English and Italian speakers. So hopefully with the right translational methods, they can expand the research of emotions cross-culturally, maybe with a multi-level modeling. Second, the study compares two Western but linguistically distinct groups. This is important because most cross-cultural emotion research does focus on very broad East-West contrasts. Third, the study shows a strong recognition of linguistic inequivalencies across cultures. It accounts for how emotional terms like vergogna in Italian don't translate perfectly to English counterparts like shame, which is important for future research and the literature. All of this matters because distinguishing self-conscious emotions has an important clinical implication. Maselli and Castelfranci's article explains that distinguishing these emotions is crucial in treating conditions such as narcissism and self-destructive behaviors, where guilt and shame will often overlap. So understanding these distinctions across cultures can help clinicians design more tailored and culturally sensitive interventions and treatments.